computer. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Hegum. I am one of the co-founders of the Accounting Alchemy Network. I'm very excited to be here today for a special social forum experience. Heads up, half of my face and my neck is numb from some dental work this morning, so I might sound a little bit different than usual. But I'm excited to be here with Stacie, Ingrid, and Alex. We're going to have an amazing conversation and get into all the beautiful things about what it really means to be in practice as a regenerative accounting professional with a very specific topic today. But before we get into that, and I pass the ball over to Stacie to introduce herself, for those of you who are new to the Accounting Alchemy Network, you found our YouTube channel. Hopefully that's where you're watching this. So congratulations. Watch all the content. There's amazing content here. Inside or below in the descriptions, you'll find our website. You can go check out our website, sign up for our newsletter, follow us, and find us, of course, on our social media platforms. We're on both Facebook and LinkedIn. But we just launched the high-low community. And if you don't know what that is, well, then you should Google it. And also, you should sign up for our newsletter. Then in the newsletter, you'll get the invite and you'll be able to find out about all these awesome conversations we're having over in that space. And for those of you who are brand new to the Accounting Alchemy Network, just to give you a sense of what we are and what we stand for, we are a grassroots movement empowering accounting professionals to be the change that we want to see in the world, to stand up for things like climate justice and racial equity, and understand the role that we have as accounting professionals in helping to shift the narrative around capitalism, money, and ultimately what we hold ourselves and others accountable to. So with that, I'm going to pass over to you, Stacie, to introduce yourself and lead us through this experience. Go for it.
Wonderful. Thank you. First of all, I'm not as dynamic as you are, Matthew, so I'll try to follow in the footsteps. And I thought we would maybe first take a couple of minutes just to take a few breaths and kind of ground ourselves. And I'll leave it up to everybody to do on their own, taking a nice deep inhale, maybe for 4 through the nose. And then a nice long exhale through the mouth. I always need that when I start talking because I get myself moving and shaking. And then I thought, as a really quick grounding, I have a reading. It's that I actually read yesterday in one of my daily. And I just kind of, I felt like it was applicable to maybe this group and those of us. It's certainly applicable to me in kind of always searching and for the gifts and what we bring as accountants into the regenerative space, into the space that we're looking to lead and make things better. And so I just thought I would share. And it's a daily book called The Book of Awakening by a poet, actually, by the name of Mark Nepo. And this was on November 17th, and it was, "Do you want to leave? Walls are worn away a grain at a time, and hearts are opened a feeling at a time." Susan and I were sitting in an ice cream parlor when the two couples next to us, oh wait, sorry, that's the wrong one. November 18th, The Puppy in the Pound. "Everybody can love in the place where they are. We can all add our share of love without leaving the room," by Helen Nearing. At dinner, a friend who was interviewing for a job shared how she sometimes felt too eager for their acceptance. She said she found herself inwardly yelping like a puppy in the pound, "Pick me, pick me." We all laughed because we all do this. At some point of inner confusion, we assume that we are orphaned of all gifts and possibilities. During these painful times, we imagine that we are so small in what we have to offer that we become desperate to belong anywhere at any cost. To make matters worse, we then hide parts of who we are, certain that if the potential boss or partner or new friend were to know all about us, they couldn't possibly accept us. Once inside this thinking, it is hard to repair, and the challenge repeatedly is to stop giving ourselves away. For what good is it if only a sliver of you remains? What good if only your ear is accepted and the rest of your body must be kept out of view? What good if only your obedience and good manners are accepted and the rest of your passion and personality must be kept in hiding? In truth, no one can live with a sliver, for slivers, even of gold, are near impossible to hold. And for me, this is uh, appropriate in this topic. My current role is, can give me many titles: head of finance, head of accounting, CFO of a fairly business as usual company, although we're working to try to change how we do things in our hotels. But one of the things that I am continually working on is how we budget. And this is something that for years and years, and even in my past roles, always working in the accounting and finance role within an existing company, I've always questioned the function of budgeting. It's what we do, and I actually love budgeting. But more particularly over the last few years, where I started to take coursework and start to learn about regenerative leadership, changes in how we're doing business, circular thinking, et cetera. The concept of budgeting for me and my roles continues to come back into, this makes no sense. We push out these annual budgets. We try to plan for things in the future. We tell people either spend it or lose it. And none of it really makes sense. So a couple years ago, I started to just read everything from agile business to beyond budgeting, and different things, primarily for the role that I'm in, to try to see if I could convince the company that I work for to look at budgeting differently. A couple years ago, I presented what I'm going to share very quickly, my quick presentation based on the concept of beyond budgeting. And I don't think beyond budgeting is the be all and end all. It was just kind of my starting point. I ultimately got shot down, to be perfectly honest. I couldn't convince anybody that a change in how we budget was warranted. We went back to the very traditional top-down budgeting. They produced budgets that, were completely crazy. We don't even use last year's budget as a comparison. So this year, as we went through some changes to the organization, I again approached the CEO and said, hey, can we look at budgeting differently? And he said, sure. So that was a month ago. And so as everybody knows, if you start budgeting in October for next year, that's a scary place to be. So while I'm not going to likely be able to roll out anything major, I'm able to implement some small changes. And so as I was telling Ingrid, is I don't really have any answers to my question. And that is, what can budgeting look like in the regenerative world and in a different space? I just have lots of questions. And so I really am wanting to put this information out there and the questions I have, and see if I can, I'm really looking for brainstorming answers, maybe more questions, because I really do believe in this space of regenerative leadership and regenerative business. Budgeting is a place that really has a lot of potential to change and really change the way businesses operate. So I'm going to share my screen really fast. And like I said, this is specific to beyond budgeting, which is actually, there are companies primarily in Europe that use it. So I'm going to skip through some of it, but I think it really kind of gives a good, a good screen share. Okay, there we go. Can you see my screen? Good, okay. So I'm going to skip over the specifics to beyond budgeting, because that's not necessarily what I'm trying to promote, but I do think that it's actually a good idea. It's a good start. So, sorry. There we go. Okay. And I will share this too, because I think these are some really good reading if anybody is interested in the concept of beyond budgeting, but as well. But one of the things that really hit me when I started down this path of trying to understand budgets is, why do we budget, and the history of budgets, which admittedly I had no idea. I just assumed we'd been budgeting forever. I have my personal budget. I've done project budgets, company budgets, annual budgets, quarterly budgets, budgets for a trip, just everything. It seems to be what we do. But what I really found interesting was the history of budgeting, and that it actually was derived from the Latin word vulga, meaning a leather bag or knapsack used for carrying supplies of food. And the budgeting actually began in England as early as 1760. And not that it's a surprise once I learned this, but it literally was how the king was able to check the power and levy taxes. So that for me really started to hit. Like, we continue to use this concept in our everyday business that was designed to control spending and literally have control by the king. Also, the first US president that actually used a government budget was Taft, who was the 27th US president, which again took me by surprise that that there were 26 US presidents that actually never had a government budget. And then business budgeting actually started with, not a surprise, our big business titans in the early 1900s, with McKinsey, General Motors, DuPont, et cetera. So again, for me, this, as I started to dig into the history of budgeting, it really hit me that we're using a system that is so old and very archaic. And it really has not been changed or modernized from what I can tell to this day. I found this was Mr. McKinsey's original, this was one of the first publications about budgetary control, and why we need basically to control. And so again, I found that pretty fascinating as I started to look. So one of the things, and again, and this is primarily from Beyond Budgeting, but I think we can probably all agree, is annual budgeting problems is, it's time consuming. It doesn't link strategy. It creates illusions of control. There's conflicting purposes. It's, for me, one of the things that, it stimulates unethical behaviors. People spend or they try to hide spending. So a variety of things that become an issue. If we look at the purposes of annual budgeting, we're looking to really, it's senior executives. I mean, really, it's the CEO, the president, the board, basically trying to tell everybody else exactly how much revenue they need to produce and how much to spend and how to spend it. And I think even in the most forward-thinking companies, that still is how budgets are designed. Or even if it is a bottom-up, we produce a budget from the managers and the people on the ground, but ultimately the CEO comes in and says, no, that's not good enough, or we need to change it. And that's certainly been my experience. The other thing too is, one of the things that I found interesting is that it is, when you really start to look at it, we're mixing aspirations with expectations when you're looking at an actual annual budget. Again, I'm going to kind of skip through some of this stuff, but I'll share it because I want to get more to the conversation. One of the things that I've really started to dig into is how to solve that conflict. How can we take an aspiration of what we want to happen and the expectation of what we think will happen, and how do we put those two pieces together? And in some ways, they're two very different pieces of the puzzle. And if we can set targets, if we can forecast, and then how do we allocate our resources? Again, by creating a budget that is flexible and maybe isn't set so far ahead, because as we all know, in life and in business, what's going to happen in November of next year, none of us know. This was, I can't remember what book I pulled this from. It might have been from Beyond Budgeting. This also really hit me hard about when I was starting to look at how we see budgeting and the difference between a traffic light and a roundabout. A traffic light is a system designed with the assumption that people will prioritize their own interests. And I think that's really what budgets do, is traffic lights make decisions on behalf of drivers and reduce the need for individuals to use their own judgment calls. We all know when we drive, we get to the red light, it tells us we have to stop. And when it turns green, it tells us we have to go. There's no judgment. We don't have to think really about anything. It's telling us what to do. Traffic lights come with established regulations, and even in situations where it might be more efficient and equally safe to proceed through a red light, the rule is not to do so. On the flip side, is a roundabout. When approaching a roundabout, the shared objective is to navigate it safely and efficiently. Success hinges on everyone's consideration and clear signaling of their intentions. An essential element of the roundabout is that there is a shared understanding of the purpose and expectations, allowing everyone to autonomously decide when to proceed or not. We have trust and confidence that others will make informed choices, contributing to smooth and safe traffic flow. So I really took this and really kind of looked at from a budgeting perspective. And I think the annual top-down budget is really all about stoplights. We don't trust the individuals in our company. We don't trust the individuals in our business to make informed decisions, versus if we were to approach it more from a roundabout perspective, it's when is it safe to proceed? How do we collaborate? How do we signal to each other that we're going or stopping? And therefore, how can we use that in the concept of budgeting and planning for a business? This then goes into the principles of beyond budgeting, which I have found to be for me, makes the most sense in trying to realign how we budget. It's not necessarily, I won't necessarily go through it, but I'll share this because I really do think it focuses on autonomy, and allowing individuals that are on the ground to make these decisions, not having to have a preset number, and instead being able to say, we have this opportunity to do something. Where can we find the money to then to allocate towards that expense so that we can do good or grow our business in this area, versus automatically saying you have $500 for office supplies. If you don't spend it this year, you won't get it next year. So everybody runs out and buys $500 of office supplies, even if they don't need them. And I think for me, that's a very simple example, but that's one of the areas for me that has become increasingly concerning. And I'm trying to find how can you not overspend, but not underspend without having a budget. What I did this year, I'm going to unshare. Stop sharing. I don't know how. Let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing. Layout, share. I don't know why it's not. That's very odd. Oh, there it is. Okay. What I proposed to change how we're doing it this year is a lot of companies, whether nonprofit, profit, for profit, have external stakeholders, unfortunately, that always want a budget. Banks, investors, various individuals, and we have that. So we're producing an annual budget that's top line. It's being produced by two individuals who can generate the revenue and expenses based on revenue. And basically we're producing a valuable and meaningful budget for the year, but it's only for the eyes of the banks and the investors and partners. And then what I've requested is to have our teams that are on the ground, are running, in this case, hotels, work on quarterly budgets so that they can really dig in and look at what their needs are for the first 3 months of the year. And that's what they're held accountable for. That's where we're looking at, did you meet your budget? Did you exceed your budget? And where they can really dig into their needs. They can look at their own team members, salaries and those types of things. on a quarterly basis and then do it quarterly. And that's my first stab at trying to change the beast of what is an annual budget and top down. But I continue to be challenged with this idea of, can a company run without a budget? Or without forecasting, and how might that work, and how might we bring in regenerative principles, and other principles of living systems design, of removing the mechanistic aspects of budgeting, and change what budgeting looks like. And like I said, I have more questions of it than I actually have answers. But I'm really curious to find out if anybody else has worked in the realm of budgets or seen anything differently or has any ideas. I'd love thoughts.
I'll jump in. So we did a sorry, my brain's not working because of the food thing. We did a thing, a lyceum, where I spotlighted some of the work that I did with a nonprofit arts organization called the Rhapsody Project. And you can find that on our YouTube channel if you're watching. It's in there somewhere. And that organization's mission is in part to address racial inequality. And so having conversations about money in an organization that is decentralized in its leadership, where there's a very clear emphasis on ensuring that people understand where they're coming from, where other people are coming from, create the space for listening. It is, that's a part of that was a part of the conversation and part of the process. And so there were sort of two things that we did that we found were like really important steps in the process in order for the organization to begin the process of creating budgets that they felt were in alignment with the nonprofit's sort of mission and in alignment with its values. One was we acknowledged that, money has not just an impact on us from a business perspective, but from a personal perspective. And so we actually subcontracted a money coach to come in and work with the staff through a sort of certain method or a tool, almost like an personality assessment tool for people to understand like what their money archetypes were and how those money archetypes were tied to narratives about past and present experiences related to finance and money. So that they knew what they were carrying into the space, right? And so if your money archetype is a dominator, right, one of the archetypes, or the wounded, then oh, my default archetype is the wounded, and so when I show up in this conversation about money, I'm subconsciously or unconsciously bringing that into the conversation, and that becomes the lens by which I have dialogue. Right. And that actually created this really interesting ability for people to then like take off one hat and put on another and start to see, oh, there's different narratives around money that I could have that would help me to access this conversation and ultimately make different decisions about the dialogue. And what was interesting about that was there was sort of the personal side first, and we really invested some time in getting to know who each person was and what their money archetype was and what some of those personal stories were. And then we brought that into a second session where we said, okay, great. Now let's talk about like organizational finances and let's experiment a little bit. Like, what if we have a surplus of cash? How do we make a decision about that? And how do we try on making that decision with this archetype versus that archetype? Does it change the dialogue? Which archetypes are actually really valuable depending on the state of the organization? And it was cool. And then on top of that, we were also just dealing with the varying levels of education and awareness on the mechanics of finance and accounting. Does everybody know what a financial statement is? Do they understand how to process, like read this document? Are they comfortable inside of an Excel spreadsheet? If not, Like, what can we do to make the data more accessible to people and elevate the level of comprehension and understanding around the language that we're using? And so you couple that knowledge, that sort of functional knowledge with that, with I guess what you could consider almost like emotional intelligence around money, created much more effective collaborative dialogue that felt more equitable around money than say letting the executive quote executive director, which they don't have a traditional executive director, decide what the budget is, run that by the board, get their approval, and say, all right, everybody, here's what we're doing. Right. That in fact, it was a staff-led and staff-facilitated conversation around what the finances needed to be for the organization. So that's a very clear, to me, a very clear example of one way that I've done it. Yeah.
I actually joined that Lyceum, and Matthew, I loved it. One of the things I wrote it, I think, like if I had had a crayon, I would have done it like big, bold, or Sharpie. Is that, and I think it was the woman that was the coach that you had brought in. She made the comment that money is energy, that I think I sat for probably a half hour after that Lyceum and really started to process that very basic, but for me, it was a very powerful statement. And then really starting to look at it in how that affects everybody from the CEO down. Again, we're a hotel, so a CEO down to the housekeeper, and what that can mean. So I loved that Lyceum, and I will say that brought a lot into kind of some of my thinking over the last few months as well.
Cool. Yeah. Candace Fox was her name, by the way.
Yes, yes.
Fox. Ingrid.
Right.
Yeah. Stacie, I loved the presentation, and I particularly loved how you brought in the idea of reviewing and adjusting budgeting more frequently, at least quarterly. I think that that's an important piece, and also bringing in more decentralized conversations. Like you were just saying, in hotel, CEO down to the housekeeper. How do we get buy-in from all levels of the team, recognizing that that's a big part, as you're talking about some of the issues with budgeting being around, people spending money that, in ways that haven't been agreed on, and hiding spending, or, feeling like they have to overspend to meet budget guidelines and such. And getting back to the core intention of, what is the budget for? Like, why are we doing this? Are we doing this because the bank is requiring? Why is the bank requiring this? Like, it really just comes down to making it so that everyone who's working together understands, with the best of our current knowledge, what are we agreeing to? Recognizing that the situation's going to change. And so we're going to have to adapt and change. How much wiggle room do we have to adapt and change? What are we anticipating coming up, and what are our agreements, so that we can enter into informed consent conversations? But it's not framed up that way in the business as usual model that we find ourselves in. And so we end up going about budgeting from this, crazy control method. And so I think that what you're suggesting with the company that you work with, around, okay, how can we go about this differently, is a huge step in the right direction. And I guess the big question that's probably on the minds and hearts of, many Accounting Alchemy folks and people watching this replay is, okay, so what are the actual steps to doing it differently? What are the actual steps to changing this conversation and having a different kind of conversation? So yeah, I would love to hear about the step-by-step strategies to employ. And just as an example to kind of kick us off, having been on the board of a nonprofit in the past that operated sociocratically, we're a nonprofit, need to have a budget. We're asking people for grants, and the grants want to see our budgets. And we did everything participatory budgeting style, meaning that everyone at every level got to have full view and transparency and some level of say in what was going into the budget, so that we're not just, having budgets imposed upon people Everyone has the ability to participate in creating the budget, have buy-in, and have an informed consent conversation. And if something in that budget is not effective, isn't going to work, something like that, it's complicated. And once you get used to it, it's actually not that complicated. And so tossing just that idea of participatory budgeting out onto the table as one potential strategy, I would love to hear what other strategies might be present in the room.
I'll jump. One of the things that I laid out the plans kind of like for Q1 and basically have shared with everybody, listen, Q2 may look very differently, right? This is a bit of an experimental, and sorry, my dogs are going crazy. And one of the things, to your point, Ingrid, is participatory, is especially in the for-profit, business world, typically managers, department heads are bonused if they meet or beat budget, right? And that's where sometimes the unethical business behaviors come in. And an example that I will share, which I think can be spread across even nonprofits, is doing the things to repair and maintain, let's say if you have an office space or if you own a building, right? If sometimes those things get cut because, wow, we spent too much over here. So if I just don't do the maintenance on the air conditioner this month, then I'm going to meet budget. But then 5 months down the road, right, the AC breaks down and it costs more money. And that's a very simple example. But for me, that's one of the spaces that I find really frustrating about budgets is sometimes setting the budget is not so much the difficulty. It's allowing flexibility in the budget, and I guess eliminating the fear to be flexible within a budget. But I do think I think part of it's almost ingrained in us certainly as Americans, and we all have so many of us have our household budgets. So many of us are used to or have in our life live paycheck to paycheck, and so that fear of having that budget written down or whatever is almost kind of ingrained in how we function. And therefore, being able to say, hey, I have to spend this money because if I don't, I'm going to go over budget. But if I don't, it's going to cost us more down the road, and being able to have that freedom. And I think the foresight to be able to look at those things sometimes can be difficult. And I think that is the case, whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit even, is sometimes that constant collaboration too, is the participatory budgeting. But then once you're in it and you're moving, is how do you be able to be flexible?
Yeah. I want to toss this to Alex in just a moment, because you're bringing up a question for me, Stacie, that I think Alex will have some just amazing ideas on around. Money is just one of the flows of energy around us. And another flow of energy that we have not been accounting for in our multi-capital discussions is time. How do we budget for our time? Where is, because here we can be in a scarcity mindset around money and other forms of capital, and at the same time, accountants are notoriously time poor, in large part because we do that thing that you just mentioned with the air conditioner, only we do it with our time. We don't invest the time wisely in things like exercise and eating well. I'm looking at myself here. And then down the line, it catches up with us in, oh, you can't just make up that time out of the blue. Like there needs to be invested in increments over a longer period of time. And how do we go about that? And so thinking about budgeting in, a lot of these budgeting financial conversations with business are in large part a symptom of the larger problem that we have made financial capital the only thing that's important in our business discussions. So I would love to hear if Alex has any thoughts around what might a multi-capital budget look like? No pressure.
Uh, yeah, I think there's a couple steps I need to take before I get there, but um, I don't think what's been coming through very well in our multi-capital discussions is that the point of multi-capitalism is shifting from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset. Um, Multi-capitalism comes out of something called asset-based community development. And it flips the script. Instead of saying what's wrong with a community or what's wrong with a company or what's wrong with a neighborhood, it says what's right. What do we have? And how can we take what we already have and do something with it? And so, um, Stacie, I liked how you were talking about the scarcity mindset in terms of like, so many of the things that companies run into with budgeting is that scarcity mindset makes people spend or not spend, depending on the situation, right? And I think scaling down some of these ideas into businesses, community development into businesses has been a little bit of a challenge, and finding like analogies. But something that I'm wrapping my head around is things like deliberately developmental organizations are spending a lot of time training all members of an organization or a business how to step into roles that require education and expertise. I so just to preface for those of you that don't know me, I'm an ex-system economist. I'm a small business owner. I'm not a professional accountant. I have taken accountant classes, so I know the basics, but I don't know accounting to the depth that you all do. However, as an economist and a business owner, when I'm looking at things like DDOs, deliberately developmental organizations, part of that's rooted in, which aligns with the next economy or the next system that we're trying to move into after neoliberalism, is this idea that expertise is often the barrier that creates a lot of these control problems. And I draw really heavily on Caitlin Rosenthal's book, Accounting for Slavery, in looking at how the development of accounting really emerged in the modern capitalist era, and how much of the ability or need to control slaves, control land, control resources, to create what's essentially an aspatial version of feudalism, where you're bringing all of the factors of production to a place rather than generating all the things from the place itself, has created these control problems. And budgeting goes right along with the accounting in that you need to control where things are coming from. And that's inherently based on scarcity. This location that I have doesn't have everything I need, therefore I'm going to take it from somewhere else. And when we come out of this multi-capital approach, we're thinking about this from abundance. What do we already have here? What are the relationships that I need to develop, or the investments I need to make into my people, into my land, into other places that have resources that we could use and collaborate? And how do we work together so that we're always giving back more to the system rather than extracting for our own use? So building on that, we also have Lift Economy, and some of their principles in building organizations and flows of resources and governance has a lot to do with education and transparency. And I think when we dig into some of the DDO stuff with expertise, it's building in education, just like you were talking about with the housekeepers, building in education in how to think about resources and money. And if we're thinking about this from an abundance standpoint, so here's one of the assumptions that I'm making here. That we have fixed costs versus variable costs. And I'm assuming that most of what's coming up here with budgeting is around variable costs and not fixed costs, right? Okay. And then of course you have the higher level decisions about allocations in terms of, particular plants or subdivisions or whatnot, how much they're making, and major strategic decisions. But it sounds like most of the issue right here is the variable costs, right? Yeah. Okay. So there is a book by a woman named Zeller, Zelizer. It's called The Social Meaning of Money. And she talks a lot about how money, people don't use money the same way, and they don't think about money, particularly in budgeting and household budgeting. People had jars for like different savings accounts, and where they receive money from and how it's received actually impacts how they think about what it can be spent on and where it can be spent on. And so I'm wondering if there's a way to think about like some sort of a sociocratic way of or collaborative or distributed way of having like maybe like these mock, almost kind of like building on the petty cash box idea, where everyone's learns that there's these general principles based on what can and cannot be used in these different petty cash boxes or these different savings, like just create a bunch of like savings. And always thinking about the relationships that are behind the energy, not just the energy, but also the relationships behind every single asset account or abundance account. I'm sorry, that's kind of like an explosion of words and ideas. But those are some of the things that I was thinking about.
It was, yes. It was awesome, Alex. And I think it brings up so many more thoughts and questions, which is exactly what I'm hoping for with this concept and this question is not only, and then back to your comment, Ingrid, too, is the budgeting, not just of the money that's in the bank, but also the time and the energy and of our employees and our team members and what they bring to the table, our impact on the community, and not just ESG type reporting, but really some of those different things in our world too, which I love. There is bartering going on with a local musician who might come in and play in the lobby, and therefore gets a couple free nights stay, which I love. But also being able to look at some of those spaces. We try to do a lot of work with farm to table and local farmers, and bringing produce into our restaurants and those types of things, again, specifically to my company. And so how do we budget in those spaces? And what I'm looking to hope to be able to eventually do is, through a difference in how we budget, encourage those spaces and encourage that it may cost more to get your produce from the local regenerative farmer, which is what we really try to do. But ignore that as it relates to your bottom line, and how do we show the profitability in terms of the impact on the community, the impact on the environment, and those types of things, which of course is fairly absent from a traditional budget. And then also knowing the individuals that have most of the information are the ones, in our case, whether it be the individuals that tend to the landscaping or the housekeepers, or the individual that works the front desk. They're the ones ultimately that have most of the answers. But instead, we tend to just give them a number and say, this is what you have to go with. So like I said, I think I have more questions, and how we can take what is just ultimately still ends up being a piece of paper, right, or an Excel spreadsheet or something that's for the whole year, and move it into a space where it's just almost a constant. Use it as a form of conversation, rather than a static document that everybody is held accountable to throughout the year.
One thing that I want to kind of bring in as a little bit of a just thing to chew on is the difference in budget discussion needs between for-profit versus not-for-profit organizations. And most of the time when I've done budgets with organizations, it's because they're nonprofits and they're using those budgets for grants and things like that. And for the most part, when it comes to for-profit businesses, or at least, technically for-profit businesses, even if that profit is being used for more generative purposes than personal profit. What I end up saying to them when they're like, oh, we need a budget, it's like, do you? Who told you need a budget? Do you actually need a budget? Do you want a budget? Because it sounds to me like what you're looking for is a forecast. You want some idea of what your cash flow is likely going to be based upon the historical so that you can make educated decisions. You don't want a follow this or you'll be in trouble budget. That is not what you want. You want your business to be able to shift when things change, and you want to be able to be at. Why would you have to answer to this piece of paper agreement that ends up being an arbitrary decision made in a moment based on what you think is going to happen, but then when that thing changes, now you're stuck? That's a lot of work for really not what you're looking for. Let's create a forecast for you. So I'm curious, with this hotel, which I'm guessing is a for-profit entity, why do they want a budget?
Well, for us, it's banks, investors, stakeholders. It's also to make sure at the end of the month, there's at least a break even. It is how, again, it's the industry, and I don't actually come from that hotel industry traditionally. It is how bonuses are determined. It is how, it's the lifeblood, literally, of how they function. But it really, to your point, becomes it's just a constant, and there's so much stress, and I feel a lot of chaos around it and stress around it, and also as fellow, as accountants, no, let's capitalize that so that it doesn't hit my P&L. And I'm like, no, but you repaired something. And so from a tax perspective, we want to expense it because then we don't, so we get into a lot of very nuanced debates on how to account for things solely to meet the budget. And so again, it's this arbitrary thing that's out here that everybody is so driven versus and not across the board. I mean, there's I'm grateful to work for it's for profit for the company that I work for and what they're trying to do and really taking care of team members. But what often happens, which I think is often the case, is some great idea or opportunity might show up to be able to do something different or good. And the answer is, well, it's not in the budget, and that's so often, I think is the case. And so, for me, that's kind of the nexus of so much. I think for me, the biggest nexus for this is over the last couple of years is the stress and the amount of work that goes into developing an annual budget, which for the most part, everybody says, oh, well, we all know that by the first month of the year, that budget is out the window anyway. And so I'm like, well, why do we spend so much angst and time and conflict to produce something in the old fashioned way? That for me is there could and should be a different way. Alex.
What you're saying is making me think about my own business with my employees. I'm pretty transparent with them. One of the things I do is like, okay, these are all the fixed costs. And this is what's left over. I do a sliding scale revenues. So keeping my employees having a transparency in terms of how much money is coming in is really important so that they feel like they're being paid appropriately. And so it's kind of like once I remove the their labor costs, I'm like, okay, this is the bucket we have left over. And then these are all the things that we need to do. And this is where the flexibility is. So it makes it a lot easier for them to feel comfortable coming to me and saying, hey, we need like new office chair. I would like to take this education class, or being really creative about co-creating the business with me. Not sure if that's helpful at all, but
It is. I love that, Alex. And that's one of the things, even though everybody always tells me, is what I've suggested is rather than doing minute line item budget, like have just a big bucket. The marketing team, here's what you've got. And then you can decide, which is very similar. It sounds like, this is your bucket. And so make the decision, even on the fly, what is the best way to use that money for the needs right now, rather than worrying about that you're going to spend a specific amount in 10 months. But that I really like that approach.
The follow-up piece to that is that the more that's spent, the less, like if you have a stakeholder model instead of a shareholder model, then your employees are your stakeholders too. So the caveat is they're incentivized not to just spend willy-nilly, because then as stakeholders, whatever's left over on the profit at the end of the year is then distributed to all the stakeholders. Now, when they are utilizing part of that bucket intentionally for things like continuing education, then that's where multi-capitals come in, where it's like, okay, you may not be getting a cash payout at the end of the year, but you are getting a human capital investment or something else. So it helps them feel the dynamic pressure of what to do with that pot, and not just seeing it as like a commons that can just be like, oh, really exploited.
Matthew.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to give you the okay to talk, or let's go.
Getting the okay. Yeah, finally my face is starting to not be numb, which I'm so excited about. Yeah, I think something that comes up for me too is like this idea that, with transparency, right, comes awareness of what's occurring. And then with an awareness of what's occurring, then you start to see things and understand things that you might not see and understand, right? And so I remember I was in a situation recently where I was quite privy to the finances of an organization and the decision making around that organization. And I began to get very frustrated because my experience was as such that I could see how much certain team members were making and not making, and what the logic was behind the compensation, and then how the compensation related to the financial infrastructure, and then how that translated back to for example, the payment of debt, past debt, and then I started to get really frustrated, because I was like, I could see that and like who was getting paid when and who wasn't getting paid when, and like the timing of everything, and I started to get to this point where I was like, this doesn't feel fair, right, to the people in the environment. And I struggled with it, because it was like, on one hand, inside of the systems that we have as entrepreneurs, as small business owners, right? A small business owner, a founder specifically, right? The quote CEO will put years of labor, right, and time and energy and effort and money and relationships into building something, right? To the extent that and I have mixed feelings about this word, that there's an entitlement to, I did this work, I put in this effort, I carried the burden. And in fact, in some cases, they legally carry the burden of the responsibility. And yet that burden somehow gets passed on to the current team members, right? And it brings up this issue of consent for me. It's like, well, just because you become somebody's employee, right, or contractor, are you responsible for carrying the burden of that past debt, right? That decision making that business owner made that brought them to this point. Because on one hand, you wouldn't be here if they didn't make those decisions. You wouldn't be receiving any of this, in this case, financial compensation, if those series of events hadn't occurred. But on the flip side, it's like, we don't, we don't know. I mean, I think a lot of people, when they sign up to work for a company, they don't know what they're signing up for from a financial perspective, because there isn't that sort of clarity and transparency. And then for me, it then starts to bring up this other question of like lifestyle choices. It's like, okay, well, I see you, Stacie, and you're driving a Ford and I'm driving an Audi, and she's taking the bus, and they eat out on weekends, and they like to go to dance classes. And so, like, how do you reconcile the lifestyle choices that are occurring inside of this ecosystem when there's people who, it's like, it's not my place to say, oh, Stacie, you should not be driving that car. You should not be taking those classes. And yet somehow that's part of this equation of the experience that you have when you get present to, oh, wow, this is how the money is actually moving inside of this organization. And these are the decisions that are being made. So I'm curious how anybody in this space would sort of interact with that, and maybe even advice for me because I always get stuck in those moments of like the conflict of believing it should go one way and yet understanding the alternatives. So yeah.
Ingrid.
Oh. Did you want to respond to that at all, Stacie, before I dive in with ideas?
Yes, all of the above, Matthew. And one of the things that I kind of piggybacking on it again for me, and I would say it in all the companies that I've worked for, also within the company, is you have different departments who tend to get the marketing department versus maybe the HR department versus the sales department. Like, you have these different departments who are allotted more money or more space to do things. And that's something too, that as through the budgeting process, and like I say, kind of piggybacking on what you're talking about a little bit, is that phenomena to me too, is that there are within even a company different employees, or because of the skill and the department that they represent, it's almost afforded almost a higher level. And whereas other departments are like, well, you have to do just as much work, but you get less money, you get less resources, because for whatever reason, it's maybe seen not as important. So yeah. It's all yours, Ethan.
There's so much juicy going on here. Okay, so I think I'm starting to see some like bigger picture connection elements of some of this discussion, and it's really rooting right back into kind of the woven together 5 principles of regenerative accounting, how all of this is connected. And what I'm noticing is that, once again, Peter Drucker says culture eats strategy for breakfast. And oftentimes, accounting professionals and many others are trying to find strategic solutions to cultural issues. And that a big part of the problem that we are dealing with right now is what Matthew was just talking about, these limiting beliefs that we've been programmed with from a very, very young age of this is how this works. And that in order to effectively employ a new workflow, a new strategy, we need to first delve into some of the cultural elements that we are trying to change. We need to put the why before the how, strategy being the how, tactics being the what. But let's start with why. And as you were talking just a little bit ago, Stacie, you were saying something that got something in my head. I forget exactly what you were saying, but you were talking about the way that, people say, oh, well, that amazing opportunity that is falling in our lap, it's not in the budget. And it reminded me of how when a child goes to their parent and says, oh, I want this thing, and the parent says, oh, your dad says no. To a certain extent, we're treating this budget, this piece of paper, this thought form, almost as an animistic entity that has some kind of will of its own, that has power over us, that now we're giving it the capability to tell us no. When we created it, we can recreate it. It's a narrative, it's a story. It doesn't actually exist. We put it into existence and now we are giving it our power. Why? So looking back at the decisions that we're making and what does it look like for us to take back our responsibility being our ability to respond in any given situation with full agency of our consent. And if we are giving that responsibility to a past me who made an arbitrary decision on a piece of paper months and months and months ago, but that now doesn't apply to our current situation because there was a pandemic or there's this new opportunity, we are tying our own hands. It's not effective, but yet we are giving our power away. And here we've got these CEOs at the top of the food chain within a for-profit business who are doing that same thing and they don't even realize it. They seem to be under the illusion that somehow this is giving them power when in fact it's cutting their legs off at the knees. And the only way to shift this workflow, this strategy, this is how it's done because this is how it's been done for years, is by first changing the mindset, changing the culture of why are we doing it this way?
I love that. And it for me, the budget is, it's like this beast or this monster that you're 100% right, Ingrid. I don't think it always has to be quite so dramatic as for me, what I see budgets as. But it takes on a life of its own. And as you were talking about that, I was thinking it often leaves us, at least in my experience, it leaves us paralyzed when something changes, something else happens, because always something happens that's beyond our control that will change the course of what's going to happen this month or next month. And like an example, we have a hotel on the Oregon coast, and a few years ago when all the fires were out there, it literally paralyzed everybody because it was like, well, wait, we didn't budget for a wildfire to shut us down. And almost, there was such a limit in how anybody could respond. And I think they did very well, and I think they made a lot of great decisions, but it paralyzes to almost then be able to shift and change, not only for the right thing for the company or the nonprofit, but also to shift and change for the right thing for the employees and for the community, because you're just so stuck in this budget that it's its own entity almost. It's a life form. Almost that we sometimes, again, I don't know it's the case for everybody, but it really is that we fear to be like, okay, well, wait, we have to change you. We don't want to insult you, but we have to redo you right now. And it's not always an easy thing to do. So yes, the mindset was one of the reasons, and again, I didn't dive deep into beyond budgeting. It was one of the reasons that I was very attracted to the concept behind beyond budgeting. A gentleman in Norway actually is the one that developed it. Crazy enough, he worked for like a major energy company in Norway, and his behind that was a lot of like just completely throwing out the concepts of budgeting and changing it. And it was one of the reasons that I was really drawn to his philosophy. But then from that perspective, trying to see how it could be even further developed into the next economy, into regenerative thinking, etc. I don't have a good ending to this. I so appreciate this space to share and really to just ask questions, and my vulnerability in, that for me within the accounting space, and this space, budgeting has continued over the last few years to just constantly come up for me as something that I don't know why, but I'm so passionate, and believe really needs to be changed and can be changed. But it's just been my own thinking constantly and my own reading. So I just am so grateful for the space to kind of share, and get some amazing feedback, and hopefully, continue the conversation. Yeah, all of the stuff that we talked about today, I now have a list of things in my brain that I need to dig even deeper in, because I thought I had dug pretty deep, but I haven't even hit the surface, in some more spaces that I can start to dig into, and would love, to be able to continue the conversation, or if anybody else has any ideas, or if anybody else wants to dive into it more with me, I'd love to really,
Always.
yeah, really see if I can come up with something. Granted, it's the strategist in me that's like, oh, I have to come up with a plan of exactly how we can budget differently, but just really dig so much deeper.
So I want to toss a question by you, Stacie, to see how it lands, recognizing, that we're talking about this idea of budgeting being a strategic element that's rooted in culture that's not working. Where do we begin shifting that culture with the decision-making powers that be? And it sounds like you've already started that process, in that you've been given the go-ahead to come up with a new strategy. And what cultural elements need to be in place in order for your strategy to be effective? What it might be needed as far as re-education or conversations to be had around what does it look like to establish an actual effective budgeting process that, if we think about, like you said, the budget as a monster, if you're treating your budget that way, and that's the kind of entity that you are creating from an animistic perspective, what would it look like to instead create a helpful budget that's always there for you and is happy to be flexible and change? What would it look like to put a different energy to that animistic thought form, for lack of a better word, and to have a different relationship with it? What if we started there? And I don't know that the CEOs are going to want to be treating their budget like it's a pet, or, someone, a stakeholder with a voice in the room.
I love that. And I think for me, at least personally, that, with kind of the very loose plans I have to get started on this change I think that's at the forefront of how I'm going to. I think I was already starting down that, but I think really making that a key piece of the conversations that are now being had is changing that relationship with what the budget is. And thankfully, this change is actually, the CEO doesn't like budgets. He doesn't like budgeting. We have to have them, and he always wants them, but he doesn't really like them. So I am lucky in that. And then as being, in my role, typically it's the individual in my role that wants the budget. And so I'm lucky in that the two people that typically want traditional budgets are the ones that don't want it. But now it is, the strange piece is especially in an industry that is so wrapped into the budgets, actually trying to convince people that there is or educate and get the buy-in, that there is a different way. And that, I think that relationship piece is really key, is really the space to start. So, yeah. So I feel like I'll report back in 2 months and see how this first round, we're going to look at it from a quarter basis. We're going to change how we view it. We're going to change it to participatory. We're going to change how it affects accountability, the flexibility of it. And, I am prepared to fail, I guess, prepared to fall, and have warned everybody that how we do it this first quarter. We may need to completely revamp it to do it differently for Q2, but really kind of just jumping in and also welcoming feedback from everybody else in our company to say, you know, I have some foundation, but I'm open to how knowing that we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater and start over, I'm opening it up to if anybody else out there has ideas on how we might proceed forward, you know, I'm open to it. And I am really hopeful. I think other individuals who are not in the finance and accounting space, that are, I really anticipate some good ideas coming from those that are going to be participating in the budget and who have never been allowed or asked those questions before. Yeah. So I will I definitely will journal and document my journey over the next couple of months and then you know, see what I learn to be able to share.
Alex, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'm not sure why I didn't think about this earlier, but governments have started doing participatory budgeting. And I don't know if that's something that might be helpful as, like, obviously governments and citizen budgeting is different than in a business, but it might be a good place to look. I've been doing a lot of research the last couple months on different types of citizen assemblies. And there's kind of like a bunch of frameworks. The one that you're going to find the most is participatory budgeting that is very top down. So basically, citizens are given a bucket and said, you can spend it on whatever you want. And so it's almost like a low level, kind of like throwing a bone to a dog type of thing. The most radically participatory is probably closer to sociocracy, where it's a dynamic. There's no pre-planning whatsoever, or very, very little. And it's a dynamic system where everyone's involved up to the minute all the time in this constant negotiated process. The kind of middle way that is to automate as much as possible based on expectations, and particularly if an organization's been around for a while, then you can kind of be like, okay, we know usually it's the same amount every year, and then the rest of it can go through a more dynamic, as needed process. Yeah, so those are the three main models.
Awesome. That's really helpful. And I like the automation of takes the work out of the things that we can just automate and put to the side, and allow the time and the space and the energy to go towards the things that can be more dynamic, like you said. Love it.
Yeah, I'd imagine there'd be kind of variations in automation where, some things are just like, it's just going to be this amount, and like if we need to revisit it, then we will. Then some things can be like, okay, we know for the next 3 to 6 months, like this is your pot, this is likely going to be a big enough pot. Again, if we need to revisit it, we need to revisit it. Then you have the more dynamic, like in the moment, trying to figure it out. And then you can also have like a petty cash box version, which doesn't require deliberation at all. It just requires like a principles, like these are the things that are eligible for this petty cash box. So different levels of automation.
Love it. One of the things that Beyond Budgeting talks a lot about too is good costs. And so, really shifting team members. I think kind of back to the petty cash concept is you have that bucket that if anybody has something good that they need to spend it on, it's going to be there. And it really doesn't require a whole lot of approvals. It's just there because we trust you to use that money to something that's that's a good cost. I love that. Okay. Nice.
Yeah, I can imagine, being a housekeeper or something, like a janitor, having, instead of requisitioning like cleaning supplies or being told like these are the cleaning supplies you have, like just having, they're just like free to like requisition what they need. That's so transformed just like their jobs.
Oh, 100%. Yes. And it's amazing what individuals can do when they're given, well, when they're not given, like it's amazing to see and understand the difference of when you're not given that flexibility or that space, versus what people can do when they are. And we've had some evidence of that, and which is great. And it really can just transform what can happen. It's typically happened more accidentally though, versus on purpose. And I think that's the space is making that the norm, and our process and procedure versus having that happen by accident, and seeing the positive result.
One thing you might need to get ahead of is a warning that some expenses and costs may go up. But there's going to be a saving in costs in other ways, like productivity. And so it might be good to get ahead of that so that they don't have like this initial reaction that, oh, this is kind of like a train wreck. Which is,
Admittedly, that's one of my biggest fears is I'm like, oh crap, why did I offer to, or why did I jump into this? And I don't want it to be a train wreck, but that the advanced conversations and again, I think taking it out in smaller chunks is also, if we're looking at it for the first 3 months and it doesn't work quite right, we can shift as we move forward.
yeah. So this is one of the places where multi-capitalism really shines because you may have a superficial increase in financial costs, but then you also get a huge increase in human capital and cultural capital and social capital and all the other capitals. And so sometimes it takes a little bit of extra explaining, like, okay, this is important because social capital improves this and human capital improves that. And so yeah, it's a little bit more convoluted, but
the good thing in our industry is we have the hotel industry is known for very, very high turnover. And so that is one of the social, that's one of the pieces that becomes very obvious if people are happy in their job, and where they're working, especially in the hotel world, the turnover gets lower. And I think that that's a space when people feel trusted and empowered. There's no reason for them to leave to go work at the hotel down the street. And I think that admittedly, that's an easy metric for me, that even if some financial costs go up, we can show probably pretty quickly that people remain happy, that this has changed how they feel about their job. And therefore, when the next season rolls, they don't leave. So love it.
Well, this has been really, really great, Stacie. Thank you so much for taking the initiative to plant the seeds for this conversation and to host today. And yeah, I'm really excited to potentially schedule a follow-up in a handful of months to hear what we learn and how can those ideas continue to be shared and how can we keep this discussion rolling, because yeah, there are things that are changing in our industry and we're kind of at the bleeding edge of making it up as we go. So this is what change looks like. People hanging out in a room saying, what if we did this differently? What would different look like? What could better look like? And yeah, we're doing it. So
well, I really appreciate it. And like I say, I appreciate this space to not have any answers, and just ask lots of questions. And I definitely look forward to a follow-up as well. I'll see how things go.
Awesome.
And certainly I don't think anything that is going to, I think it will take a while. And that's what I love too. And I think it can look different for different organizations as well. So thank you all so much.
Wonderful. Any final last thoughts before we close? Okay. Thanks so much to each of you for joining us today. Thanks to everyone catching the replay. And thank you so much again to Stacie for bringing us all together today. This was really, really wonderful, and looking forward to continuing the conversation in 2025. Here we go. Okay. Bye.